Professor Nicholas Giordano returns to put into perspective the horror show we're seeing on college campuses nationwide on this episode of United Patriots Uprising with Gary Binford. I'm your host, Gary Binford. Thanks for joining us. This podcast is available at radioinfluence.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. The video version you can find at YouTube, Rumble, and Conservative Television of America. Either way, wherever you go, please subscribe and make sure your notification button is on so every time the podcast airs, you will receive it. I don't know about you, but what I've been watching on these college campuses now, it's just going to another level. It's just, I don't even know what to say. This is, not only is it disheartening, it's dangerous, people. Now, a lot of the media and a lot of the public educators would want you to believe this is organic. Like all those tents and all those placards and all these people that look like they're 45 and 50 years old on a college campus just organically happened. No. Not true. And if you don't know, and if you think this just popped up out of nowhere, you're about to find out why these things happen, who's behind it, and hopefully what we can do to get the education system under control. So are you ready? Well, let's get into it. He's a distinguished academic with expertise in political science, emergency management, and homeland security. He's a full tenured professor at Suffolk County Community College, and he has his own podcast, the PAS Report. You've seen him on television. I've seen him recently on Gutfeld a few times. I welcome back to the show for the third time, first time on video, Professor Nicholas Giordano. How are you, Professor Nick?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Gary.
Great to see you again this way. We've been at a couple events together where I've gotten to see you live, and I really thank you for coming on, and we really want to hear what you have to say, because we're watching all of this horror show going on at college campuses across the country, and the media and a lot of the administrators want to tell us, oh, this just happened, it's just organic. It just popped up out of nowhere, but you say otherwise, right?
I do. I mean, listen, this has been a slow motion train wreck over decades, but over the last several years, there have been professors, including myself, that have been warning, the diversity, equity, inclusion narratives that are being pushed on students is leading to anti-Americanism, anti-Western civilization. And we're now seeing that come to fruition. But as far as the current protests, the pro-Hamas protests, because that's what I classify them as, these are anything but organic. And, college students are supposed to be broke. They don't have money. And yet we're seeing laser printed signs that are very expensive. We're seeing the same types of tents all over the place. And we're talking about campuses that are spread apart by thousands of miles, yet they all get to go to the same tent manufacturer. So these are not organic protests that have just sprouted up. This is an organized, coordinated movement that's going on in the United States. And it's not new. It's taken a different form. We could go to the Black Lives Matter riots of 2020, the Summer of Love, the fiery but peaceful protests, where you see something similar, right? You see the similar signs, the similar narratives, the similar rhetoric. But it shows you that what the academic world has wrought for the United States, that we have an entire generation of students, and obviously not all of them. The majority of students are not participating in these protests, but you have enough of a number where they have been indoctrinated to despise the nation that they come from, right? I mean, they're sitting there, they're screaming, death to America, death to Israel, October 7th, 12,000 more times. They say America is a racist and evil country. And yet at the same time, they're praising and uplifting Hamas, a terrorist organization, an organization that's guilty of slaughtering thousands of people, an organization that has purged Christians from its land. And you're talking about one of the most intolerant ideologies that exist, that these idiots are saying is more just than the United States, because the United States is a country of injustice. It shows you that these students are not educated. They have no business being in college, but at the same time, they're not necessarily to blame because they went through a failed education system from K through 12. Now they get into college, and there are some professors that actually agree with the students' narratives that will help them craft their narratives and have the same anti-American sentiment that many of these people have. So it's a complete disaster, and we have to get a handle on it, because I don't know a single nation that could survive when you have a decent percentage of the population that despises where they come from in the nation that they're one day going to lead, and then the rest of the population that doesn't really know anything about America.
Yeah, I understand. Now, the biggest point you brought up was they bring this with them. This is where their mindset is when they are arriving at colleges. Can you please give us your opinion of the genesis of this? Because if they didn't get it in college because they just got there, where are they getting this anti-American sentiment from? Is it high school? Is it their parents? Is it what they watch on TV? Is it their friends? Or is it a combination of all of that?
I think it's mostly a combination. I would focus not necessarily on the parents. I think parents have been absent in their children's lives, and so there is some blame to go around there. But if you look at the information that's being beamed on them every given day, whether it's in school, whether it's in social media, pop culture, and what they're watching on television, you clearly see the anti-Americanism that's going on. Now, not every school is pushing anti-Americanism. I do want to make that clear, but they're not educating students on the idea of America, on the principles, on American values and concepts like liberty and freedom. And you can't defend what you don't know, right? If you don't know these things, you're not going to be able to defend it. And that's what makes these students susceptible to the anti-American messaging that they may be hearing from other sources. But then you have the segment of schools that are pushing anti-Americanism. And just to give one example, 4,500 school districts throughout the entire country have adopted elements of the 1619 Project. Now, the 1619 Project is based on a false history that never really existed. It's been debunked not by just conservative scholars. It's actually been debunked by progressive and liberal scholars as well, that it's simply not true. That this country wasn't founded solely on the purpose of racism and slavery, that had nothing to do with it. Slavery did exist. We acknowledged it exists. We teach that it exists. We don't hide from it. But it's not the purpose of the United States. That the real true purpose is 1776, right? The fight for independence, the fight for liberty, the fight for freedom, to create something new in a world that would transform civilization as we know it. And the founding fathers were successful. Not every founding father was a slave owner. You know, there's this misconception because of a failed education system that all our founding fathers were white old slave owners, when that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, there was a lot of founding fathers that pushed back against slavery from the earliest of days. I mean, if you just go to the Constitutional Convention, you have Gouverneur Morris, who spoke out against the evils of slavery. Massachusetts outlawed slavery in 1783. So that's 4 years before the Constitutional Convention. You have someone like Filippo Mazzi, an Italian merchant that came here in 1772, and he becomes the genesis, and most people don't even know this, but this Italian merchant befriends Thomas Jefferson, and he gives a speech at a Virginia church talking about the idea that all human beings are created equal. And that becomes the genesis for the Declaration of Independence. It took Congress 200 years to recognize Filippo Mazzi's contribution to our founding. But our founding is one that's complicated. It's unique. It's interesting. There's so many different people that played a role. And they weren't just all old white men. There were Black people. There were Italian people. There were Spanish people. So they're not getting that education. They're also not getting the education on what is our obligation within the system, right? We're constantly saying what government should do. But we're never ask the question, well, what is our civic obligation? What's our responsibility within the system? And civics is critical if you want to keep a strong country that's intact. It's really necessary that people know their role in the system. You know, today, a lot of people talk about that the division in society, it's tearing us apart, and that our society is headed towards a civil war. Division's not the problem. We're a free country. If you want unity, go to a place like North Korea. They have unity there. Go to communist China. They have unity there. Go to Saudi Arabia. They have unity. Division is always going to exist in a free society, especially when we're talking about politics. Mm-hmm. The biggest weakness we have today is that we have forgotten the principles that are supposed to be unifying us. And you have a whole bunch of people in the education system that now taught students that all the founding fathers were evil because of this idea of slavery. Well, then everything they created is tainted, right? And that's the whole point. That's how you dismantle structures. But everything they create is tainted. And so you have a bunch of entitled brats that despise the country they're coming from. And this is national suicide. Our country will not survive that, especially when they don't even know the basic structure of government. So it's a real problem, and we have to reintroduce a civic education, one that promotes America, not denigrates it.
So this is my question to you. I get it that these professors are teaching this, but why are the students buying into it? In other words, Professor Giordano, what happened to common sense, or what happened to the ability to question authority, or to question, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right?
Well, two things happened. First of all, when it comes to common sense, it no longer exists. I mean, we see it every single day. And part of it is because we live in our own little bubbles. I mean, listen, if you live in the United States, you hit the lottery. And I'm not diminishing people's personal problems that they face. But if you go around the world, every day is a day of survival. They're just trying to look to survive for that day. Here in the United States, we're insulated from that. And if you go back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and even the 70s, you had people that would drop out of school 6th, 7th, 8th grade, that most people wouldn't even get a high school diploma, but they had common sense because they understood the streets. Today, our children are so sheltered, partly because of the helicopter parenting, right? Everyone gets a trophy and we got to worry about everyone's self-esteem. Part of it is trying to keep kids safe. We do live in a dangerous world. It would be foolish not to acknowledge that. When I was growing up, I didn't have to worry about being, taken if I was playing outside by some sicko. Now, they did exist back then, but it wasn't like it is today. And so part of it is not necessarily their fault. It was good intentions, right? And that's the thing. There's a difference between good intentions that just ended in failure and those that are much more nefarious that want to destroy and dismantle the system. But our education system is no longer based on the idea of giving students the ability to think critically, to ask questions. And I think that this really started after 9/11. And a lot of conservatives are to blame. They may not want to hear this, but they are to blame for this. When the Patriot Act was first introduced, there were a lot of concerns with it. I mean, and I was a college student at the time, always been conservative my entire life. One of my papers was even about how we're approaching dangerous territory, that we're giving the government an enormous amount of power. And while the intentions may be good, I understand, okay? I saw how easily it could be manipulated and abused the further we move away from 9/11. However, if you questioned it then, well, you were told that if you're not doing anything wrong, what do you have to hide? If you don't want to push the Patriot Act, then you don't want to keep us safe. And people didn't realize that all you get is the illusion of safety. It's not real. It's just the illusion. And you're turning over a ton of liberty to this federal apparatus that has been notorious in abusing its power. Now, you fast forward, and throughout 2001, up until about 2019, 2020, well, what did we see? We saw that you have to respect, and I believe respect is really important to authority. I believe that we should respect police officers and teachers. We should be respecting our institutions. But we were told that you have to unquestionably respect them, that you can't question the motives of these agencies. You can't question what the intent is. You're not allowed to ask questions. Rather, just be obedient. These are people that are performing a public service trying to keep us safe. And so if you ask questions, you're diminishing. And we started to see very early on that we're building out a system of simply obedience and compliance. Now you go to the coronavirus. And what happened? Well, you literally shut down the country. The government violated almost every single aspect of the Bill of Rights. I mean, I could go one by one of how they did that. But what really stuck with me was the fact that you have this younger generation. I'm old. I got to live my major life milestones. It drove me nuts being stuck inside the home and things like that. I disagreed. I pushed back and I spoke out about it. But I at least got to live a great portion of my life. Here you have kids, right? Anywhere from 4 years old to 25 years old in the prime of their lives. And 2 years of their life was stolen from them, taken away from them. And they were told by everyone else who lived their life, who got to live those wonderful experiences, that you have to make a sacrifice because you don't want to kill grandma and grandpa, which was horrific. But what really struck a chord was they obeyed and complied. They didn't speak out. Yeah, they may have met at a park with their friends, and that's how they violated things. But they didn't speak out. There was no pushback, no one questioning the system. Why is that concerning? Because this is the age demographic that's supposed to be rebellious. This is the age demographic that's supposed to push back. It's the older people that are supposed to say, comply and listen to government. The younger people are supposed to be the ones that are supposed to fight the system, and they just didn't do it. And when I ask my students, well, why didn't you push back at all? They'll regurgitate the same, well, it was a pandemic and they were trying to keep us safe. And where in the Constitution does it say that it gets suspended in a pandemic? Where in the Constitution does it say that a governor can unilaterally make decrees without any type of legislative input? And what difference is there between our response, where you had one and a handful of people making decisions, and the response of any authoritarian country? I mean, the very definition of authoritarianism is decisions made by one or a handful of people. And so there was no difference. And that's what really struck a chord. So that's why our education system has failed. It didn't give these students the opportunity to think for themselves. What it did, we created a system where you just obediently comply. But if you look at the works of the founding fathers said, always ask questions, always push back against government. That's our civic obligation, to question the government and question government policies, to not have this knee-jerk reaction to look to government to solve the problems. That's our main civic obligation. And we've deviated far from that. Now, if students were educated in those principles from kindergarten to 12th grade through college, well, guess what? I think that we would have seen a very, very, very different situation take place during the pandemic. Because I know when I was growing up in high school, if they tried to mask us up in high school, our principals would have quit their jobs because they would never be able to get a handle on us to do something like that. But yet now we have a younger generation that will just obediently comply because they're told to do so, and because of the fear that the government instilled in them. It really is horrific. But again, it's because you have ideological zealots that have taken over the education system rather than people that actually believe in education.
Wow. You laid that out, and it's very, very scary. And I want to use a sports analogy here. Whenever you hear coaches talking about how to build a winning team, they always talk about stacking wins. Like, you want to stack a number of wins together. Unfortunately, our government, and I'm talking about the government that's looking to take us into Marxism, into socialism, communism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it, they're looking to stack wins too. You brought up one that was very important, the Patriot Act. And once that happened and they saw that we went for it, if they didn't know previously, they knew, okay, every time America becomes afraid, we can take a little bit more of their freedom from them. What this proved, that the shutdown of the government, it proved, hey, we can shut it down. There's another stack of a negative win. This is very, very, wouldn't you say, dangerous, because they've now showed they can put a camera up and turn it on us and we'll go for it. And they've taken this liberty away and that liberty away. And with this DEI and with all the Black Lives Matter and all this, they can shut us up and they can silence the church. And now they showed, hey, we can shut the government down unconstitutionally. What's the are all these dry runs for the big shutdown?
Well, I don't think it's as organized and coordinated as that. I think it's more decentralized. Like you can't point to people that are sitting in some like conference room where they're like, yes, how do we take over and just usurp the power? It's a slow and incremental process, and it's been happening. So take something like the Department of Homeland Security, created in 2003. The whole basis of the Department of Homeland Security is to take on terrorism, to try and keep us safe. Well, again, very simple logic. This is what we call thinking critically. What would happen if the Department of Homeland Security said we succeeded in our mission, Al Qaeda and ISIS are no longer a threat? Well, then people are going to turn around and say, well, we don't need to spend the hundreds of billions of dollars on the Department of Homeland Security anymore. And so we could cut their funding. And so some of it is instinctual, right? It's national survival, that they always have to make a threat. So if Al Qaeda and ISIS aren't a threat, well, now parents at school board meetings will become a threat. Now traditional Catholics will become a threat because they may like to hear a Latin mass or something. And you see them ramp up this idea of domestic terrorism. Meanwhile, what's the evidence that we really have a domestic terrorist problem? Well, we don't. I mean, statistically speaking, we don't. Have there been a few incidents over the last decade? Yes. Are these incidents something that is out of the norm? No, it's not. Can we see increased radicalization? Yeah, just let the government keep on doing what it's doing, and it's going to create the next Timothy McVeigh at some point. And I say that quite mockingly because that's what they're the ones that are radicalizing people. But when we look at it, so you have the Patriot Act, you have Department of Homeland Security creation. You fast forward, then you get the mortgage meltdown crisis. And what happens? Well, the banks are too big to fail. So the government has to give them taxpayer dollars in order to bail them out. Not only did we bail them out with taxpayer dollars, but two things happened. We made the banks bigger and more powerful than they were even before. But more importantly, prior to the Great Recession, if a company wanted to give back in the community, if they wanted to get involved, they would build a park. They would build a YMCA. Following the bailouts, do you notice how these companies started to get involved in social issues, something that no company would have done 30 years ago? They're going to take positions on controversial social issues. And if the bank doesn't like your business, let's say you're a firearm dealer and they don't like your business, well, they're just going to shut off your account. And we've seen that happen. So you have things like that. Then you have the election of the former president, Donald Trump, where you have an entire bureaucracy that said, well, the American people made a mistake. They showed that we can't trust the American people, and we're going to anoint ourselves as the guardian of democracy. And therefore, we're going to do whatever we can to get rid of this guy, President Trump. And so they abuse their power. And we see this incrementally happening. But we also see abuses happening at the same time. 2012, you had the IRS Lois Lerner scandal where they were targeting Tea Party groups and they weren't giving them tax-exempt status. In 2014, you had the CIA spying on sitting members of the United States Senate Intelligence Committee because the ones with the power of oversight, the Senate Intelligence Committee, was investigating the CIA for possible abuses. And so they were spied on. And the point is, well, who was held accountable, right? Nobody was held accountable for the CIA, for the NSA's prison program that was collecting the metadata on Americans. Nobody was held accountable with the IRS Lois Lerner scandal. Nobody was held accountable with the CIA spying on sitting members of the Senate. Nobody was held accountable for the false Russian collusion hoax. And it just gets progressively worse as we go forward. So you had all these catalysts. And the government bureaucrats have been acquiring more and more power. And so you see this unholy alliance that I've spoken about before get built out, right? You have the Marxists and the communists. You have the bureaucrats, you have big tech, you have academia, you have the giant corporations. They all have different motives and goals and end states in mind.
Mhm.
They're not the same, but they understand that, they have some overlapping interests, and that's more power, more control. That's the overlapping interest. And I do believe that those in the bureaucracy, because everyone likes to just blame the Marxists and the communists, and we do have many of those in the bureaucracy. It's not a secret. There are many. But a lot of those in the bureaucracy also aren't Marxists, and we need to acknowledge that. And
Yeah.
so, what's the intent of them? How did they forget what public service is all about? And it's because you have these people in these positions of power that think that they're smart. They think that they can control all this. They don't realize that they've lost control.
I hear what you're saying, and a very good answer there. And what we have is a mess. Now, I'd like you to comment on what I see when I watch this campus unrest involving Jewish students and people who are pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas. There's an element of this that I see, and I hope, Professor Giordano, you're going to tell me that America sees this too. I was watching this and I'm saying, well, this is the left eating its own, because on a lot of these college campuses, the professors and the students are all leftists. I don't see Christians. I don't see conservatives on these students. Otherwise, there would have been some backup. There would have been some pushback, some help for the Jewish students. But because these are basically Marxist institutions and a bunch of kids who are on the left, you have the left fighting the left. And I hope the Jewish students are coming to understand that where they stand, that these are people that they're claiming they're all on the same side, and they're eating each other. And I hope, am I correct? I hope people see this.
Well, you are correct. I mean, it was predictable. Okay. And I've argued with this whole diversity, equity, inclusion nonsense that this is the end state, right? Because what diversity, equity, inclusion does, it puts people into groups. And you have your protected class, the victim group, and then you have the victimizers and the ones that oppress that victim group. Now, when you put everyone into a group, essentially what you're doing is you're tribalizing society. You're taking away our national model of e pluribus unum, out of many comes one. So out of the many different peoples from the many different places comes one nation. And you're creating a society that's more in tune with a place like Afghanistan, which I don't know if they've noticed, hasn't really worked out too well throughout their recorded history. But they're lumping them into all these different groups. And so what happens when one of these groups attacks another group? Well, now you got to try and pick sides, and it ends in disaster. Like you look at the current president of the United States who's trying to play both sides, and it's an epic fail. If you look at many of the college presidents that have tried to play both sides, it's been an epic fail. It's not hard to condemn Hamas. It's not hard to condemn October 7th. And it's not hard to say that Hamas should be wiped off the face of this earth. Yet these feckless administrators have twisted themselves in a pretzel trying to be wordsmiths, and they destroyed themselves and their reputations by doing that. It was only natural that these groups would begin to turn on each other. And we're seeing that in real time. And I think that there are some that are waking up to how toxic of an ideology diversity, equity, inclusion has become. That while there may have been some well-intentioned people that were pushing it, that it's no longer part of well-intentioned. It's been hijacked by a bunch of ideologues, many communists and Marxists. And we see this in these protests too, right? We see Marxism for a free Palestine, Democrat Socialists of America is marching for a free Palestine. So we see it in real time. The thing that gets less attention, though, is there has been pushback on college campuses, including in liberal institutions. I mean, you have the fraternities over in UNC that wanted to make sure that the flag didn't drop. You had the chancellor of UNC after that come out with the police officers, take down the Palestinian flag, put up the American flag, saying as long as he is chancellor of that university, that flag, the American flag, will remain. And anyone that touches it is going to be dealt with. So you do have some institutions that have decided to push back. You have students that have actually pushed back. There was one student that was raising money to hire a mariachi band to drown out the pro-Palestinian protesters. You have another student that was blasting opera music. There are pushbacks going on. I think that what we're witnessing is that the leftist movement has gone way too far. They overplayed their hand. And a lot of people were afraid to speak up because they didn't want to be ostracized. They didn't want to be criticized and targeted by the cancel culture that exists. Well, now they feel emboldened that they can, right? Courage is an infectious trait. So you have the fraternity that's holding up the flag celebrating America. And what do we see? Well, we see other fraternities on other college campuses now being more proactive. Courage is infectious, and we're seeing it spread. You're seeing a lot in the Jewish community that is saying, we've been loyal Democrat supporters our entire lives, and you abandoned us. You turned your back on us. And so we're now going to speak out against this diversity, equity, inclusion because we've been marginalized. We're now part of the oppressor class. And so they're waking up to realize that it's whoever the powers that be want the narrative to be, that's going to be who's the enemy and who are the good people. They're the ones that get to determine which groups are part of a protected class and which groups are the ones that should be targeted. And I think people are waking up to that realization.
I certainly hope so, because boy, it's getting bad out there. Professor Nick, I thank you very much for coming on and hanging out with me. And before I ask you to tell people, where they can get your products and about your podcasts, there's always that one thing I always want you to tell the audience about, and that is the test that you give your students when they first arrive in your political science class. I love this test. I wish this test was compulsory at all college campuses, but it won't be. And please tell them about your Constitution test. This story actually amazes me every time
Well,
I
they
hear
get two assignments. On the first day of class, they have to take a citizenship exam. And about 6% of the students are able to pass the citizenship exam. The other 94% fail. And when I say fail, I mean like fail abysmally. They don't even come close to passing. And it's shameful because it's really easy. Who is the current Speaker of the House? Name one of your two senators from New York State. Who has the power to declare war? What type of government do we have? Just basic questions. How many justices sit on the Supreme Court? So these are easy questions that anyone would have to answer if they want to become a naturalized citizen. Yet we have people in the United States that lived here their whole lives that can't pass this test. And I would argue that it's not just relegated to my students. If I gave it to the mass of the population, regardless of age, most would fail it. And that speaks volumes to how far we've fallen. The other assignment I give them is I give them the Constitution, only it's the Russian Constitution, not the American Constitution. And in it, I just changed Russian Federation and replace it with United States. I changed Duma and replace it with Congress. The Russian, and then they have to write 2 paragraphs on it. And we discuss it. I didn't do it this semester, actually, because someone got onto it. So I didn't do it, give it a break. But when we look at it, most of the students cannot identify that they are not reading the United States Constitution. They will willfully do the assignment without any pushback, without any questions. Now, essentially, the assignment should be one sentence. After they read the first sentence of the document, it should be, this is not the United States Constitution. The Russian Constitution starts with, we, the multinational people. Our Constitution starts with, we, the people. We don't recognize color or ethnicity or anything like that. So that's the big giveaway. But also the Russian Constitution was developed in 1992 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it has modern day concepts like pensions and healthcare and things like that in it. And so these students will talk about how smart the founding fathers were to foresee, pensions and all this stuff. And I do the assignment for 3 reasons. First of all, I do it to shame them, right? To show them how little they know about the country they've been living for many of them, most of their lives, if not all of their lives. and how little they know. Because they have opinions on every single issue that exists out there, but they can't even lay out the basic structures of government. So how can they really say what the government should or shouldn't be doing? So it opens their eyes in that respect. The second reason I do it is to show them that don't ever just trust information that you're getting because it's an authority figure, right? Because I'll ask them, some of these concepts definitely stood out to some of you students. Like you're reading this document and there were certain things that probably didn't sit right with you, where you were starting to question, why were the founding fathers talking about this stuff? Yet not a single one of you reached out to me to ask me a question. And the question is, why didn't you reach out? Well, you're the professor. You wouldn't lie to me. Well, no, yeah, I would. I obviously deceived you. And so don't just trust the information you're given to by a professor or by the media or by anyone else. That it's incumbent on you to do your own research. It's incumbent on you not to take my word for it. It's not my job to give you my opinions. It's incumbent on you to go out and seek out the information for yourself, to seek out what the truth is. And the third reason I do it is because it starts to get them to think critically. Well, if I didn't know about this, well, what don't I know about all the opinions and biases I have? How may they be flawed? It gets them to think critically, and it gets them more engaged in the subject material.
I hear you, and you're so right about you should question when something doesn't sit right. Question. I remember back a decade ago when I used to teach Sunday school, age 7 to 12. I sent one boy out of the class to get some water, and I told everybody else, I'm going to draw 3 lines on the blackboard. And you're supposed to raise your hand when I point to the longest line. And I told everybody in the class, raise your hand when I point to the shortest line. So the kid comes back with the water. I said, I'm going to show you an object lesson on understanding how to stand up for what is right. And I said, when I point to the longest line, everybody raise your hand. I pointed to the middle line, nobody raised their hand. I pointed to the short line. Everybody raised their hand except the kid that went to get the water. And he's looking at everybody. And he's like, and then he started, his hand was like this, and then he finally raised it. I said, why did you raise your hand? And he goes, because everybody else did. I said, but was that the longest line? He goes, no. And that's exactly what you just said. This is what happens. They need to question. And that goes back to where we started this conversation, that they're not questioning. And I think now we understand why, because I always wondered why things that make no sense to college kids they're letting go. And I think you've explained that now. The ability to question and the desire to question, and even the thought that you can question, it seems to be a thing of the past. Can we get it back?
We can. I mean, and I think that sooner or later we will. I think one of our goals is to actually just get students to read more. Students don't read books anymore because they got their stupid little gadgets and gizmos and their screens that they're focused on. But reading is key. And I think that we need to focus more on reading. Unfortunately, when we moved in the STEM direction, we kind of devalued some subjects like reading and social studies, ELA, things like that. I think we actually should be doing the opposite, right? There's certain people that are always going to be good in math and science, and we have to encourage math and science, and everyone should have a well-rounded education. But reading and history and political science are all important. You're going to need these throughout your entire lives, and you'll become literate, and you have to read in history. You have to understand documents. You have to be able to interpret documents when it comes to government and politics. So I think we need a revamp of the education system from top to bottom. I think it can be done. The question is there a will to do it? We're starting to see momentum. We're starting to see people say, maybe we do need to have some changes. It's not enough, but it is encouraging to see that school board meetings are packed now, right? It used to be 5 parents would show up, and that would be a lot. Now they're busy. You have parents that are getting more engaged, trying to figure out what their children are learning, what they shouldn't be learning. And you also have teachers, right? I mean, there are a bunch of teachers that are now starting to speak up and saying, I don't want to teach this. This is not something that should be taught to kids. So the opportunity is there, okay? And it's going to take a lot of work. We didn't get into this position overnight. It took time to get to this level. But I think that it will take time to fix, but it is fixable. And that's what gives me hope.
I certainly hope you're right. Professor Nick, thanks for coming back and once again sharing some of that vast wealth of knowledge you have. Please tell people how they can reach you and anything you'd like to promote.
Sure. Everyone could go to the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, or they can follow me on social media at PAS Report on most social media platforms.
I really thank you for coming back. Every time I see you on TV, I stop what I'm doing. It doesn't matter what time of the night, and I pay attention because you've learned, you studied, and you're one of the few voices I know that are looking to put out the truth and sticking up for the Constitution, because very few professors I even hear about have any desire to do what you do. So I thank you and for what you do, and God bless you and your family, and for coming on and hanging out with me again.
Well, thank you for having me, Gary. Always enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, thank you once again. There you have it, Professor Nicholas Giordano. I want to thank Professor Nicholas Giordano for coming back and giving us more of that knowledge that he has about the Constitution, about students, and about schools, and what we need to do to get this under control. I don't know if we're going to be able to do this in the near future, but the starting point is realizing there's a problem, because if we don't get the educational system under control, we're going down. Because, see, these kids are the future. And with what they're being taught now, oh boy, if we can't get this stepped on and get back to the constitutional United States, I don't even know we want to be here 20 years from now. So let's get cracking, people. We've got to start pointing out what is right, what is wrong, the enemies of America, and get this educational system under control. This podcast is available at radioinfluence.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. The video version you can find at YouTube, Rumble, and Conservative Television of America. Wherever you go, please subscribe and hit that notification button so you'll always get the shows. And wherever you get this podcast, look for the podcast archive. There is an audio version that has had over 170 high-profile guests in 3 years. Among them, just a few: Christina Bobb, Isabel Brown, Clay Clark, Monica Crowley, Rebecca Friedrichs, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, Mel Kay, Jamie Glazoff, Pastor Jack Hibbs, Gene Ho, Michael Loftus, Vince Everett Ellison, Star Parker, Judge Janine Pirro, Kenny Chu, Kevin Sorbo, Carol Swain, Brandon Tatum, Naomi Wolf, just a few that you'll find on the audio podcast. They really had great things to say. Hope you'll check that out too. Well, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for joining us. So until the next time, this is your host, Gary Binford, saying, God bless you, God bless your families, and boy, do we need God to bless America. Thanks for listening.